Some people walk onto my stage convinced they've outsmarted life, but life has a way of keeping receipts, and sooner or later those receipts get read aloud. That's exactly what happened the day this 17-year-old named Lucas sat across from me wearing that half-smirk teenagers use when they think adults just don't get it. I could tell before he even sat down that he believed he was the exception to every rule that had ever been written. Lucas had the posture of someone who'd spent years pushing boundaries without ever hitting anything solid enough to stop him. He slouched into the chair like he was doing me a favor by being there. His eyes drifted over the audience with the same dismissive ease he probably used on teachers, coaches, and anyone else who'd ever tried to hold him accountable. His mother sat beside him looking like she'd aged 10 years in the last 2. Her shoulders curled inward, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, and her expression carried that familiar mixture of desperation and defeat I've seen on countless parents' faces. She'd written to me because home had become a battleground. Lucas did what he wanted, when he wanted, how he wanted, and the consequences were always someone else's responsibility. Curfew, he ignored it. School assignments, optional. House rules, negotiable, and usually ignored. He'd been suspended twice that year, once for vaping in the boys' bathroom and once for skipping class. So many times he'd racked up a stack of truancy notices taller than his mother's patience. But what really brought them to me wasn't school or disrespect. It was the night he'd been pulled over at 2 in the morning, his mother's car swerving between lanes, headlights off, music blasting. He told the officer he was just cruising. The problem was he didn't have a license. And according to his mother, he didn't think that detail mattered. When I asked him about it, he shrugged. Actually shrugged. As if taking a 2-ton vehicle onto the road, half asleep and half aware, was no different than sneaking a cookie from the kitchen. He said the police blew it out of proportion. He said nobody got hurt. He said rules existed for people who weren't smart enough to navigate the world on their own. That was the first crack in the facade because the statement wasn't confidence, it was defensiveness in costume. Kids who genuinely believe they're invincible don't need to announce it. Kids who feel cornered do. His mother jumped in, explaining that he'd been drifting for months. His grades had plummeted. He'd quit basketball, which used to be his passion. He'd burned through 3 part-time jobs in less than 6 months. Each time the story was the same. The coach was unfair, the teacher was boring, the boss was rude. Everyone else was always the problem. But beneath his bravado, I sensed something deeper. There was a restlessness in the way he kept bouncing his knee, a flicker of anxiety in his eyes that contradicted the laid-back persona he tried to project. Teens who reject every rule aren't rebelling for fun. They're rebelling because something inside them feels chaotic, and following rules feels like surrendering control they're terrified to lose. I asked him what bothered him so much about rules. He said they made him feel trapped. He said he wanted freedom. He said he didn't need adults telling him what to do. But the more he talked, the more obvious it became that his definition of freedom wasn't independence, it was avoidance. Avoiding responsibility, avoiding consequences, avoiding any scenario that required discipline or self-reflection. Freedom in his mind meant being insulated from the fallout of his own actions. I'd seen this pattern before. Kids who grow up feeling powerless emotionally, socially, or academically often create their own power by opposing anything that resembles authority. It's not that they're reckless for the sake of being reckless. It's that rebellion becomes the only place where they feel competent. Lucas wasn't just breaking rules. He was using rule breaking as proof that he couldn't be controlled. His mother explained that his father had left when Lucas was 11 after a long period of shouting matches, slammed doors, and empty promises that cracked Lucas's sense of security. She said Lucas had changed overnight, becoming angrier, colder, and less willing to accept guidance. Rules in his mind had become synonymous with disappointment. Every boundary reminded him of someone who enforced them one day and disappeared the next. That emotional blueprint shaped everything. Lucas wasn't defiant because he was fearless. He was defiant because the last time he trusted an adult to lead, that adult walked away. The stakes of following rules became too high. Better to reject everything than risk relying on something that could shatter again. But now the rebellion had grown into something bigger than he could manage. His mother described nights waiting by the window, praying he'd come home. She said he'd disappear for hours, sometimes days, without explanation. She said he treated her like an obstacle instead of a parent. She said she didn't know how to keep him safe anymore, and she didn't know how to get him to hear her. Lucas rolled his eyes through most of her explanation, but I noticed he didn't interrupt. He didn't lash out. He didn't challenge her version of events. That told me he wasn't proud of the chaos he'd caused. He just didn't know how to admit it without tearing down the entire identity he'd built around rebellion. When I asked him what he wanted from life, he said he wanted respect. That was the first honest thing he'd said. He wanted to be seen, taken seriously, viewed as capable. He wanted what every young man wants to feel like he mattered. But respect isn't something you demand. It's something you earn. And Lucas had no idea how to build it, so he settled for acting like he didn't care whether he had it. That's when I introduced the topic he didn't expect the video, because there had been a recording from the night he took the car, the officer's dash cam, and his mother had provided it with permission. The moment I mentioned it, Lucas's entire posture changed. His shoulders tightened, his smirk faded, his eyes flicked toward his mother with something sharp, fear, shame, or maybe the first real understanding that this conversation was no longer theoretical. I told him we would watch it only if he agreed, but he didn't answer. His silence was louder than any protest. Silence means impact. Silence means the truth is pressing against the wall trying to get in. I didn't play it. Not yet. Instead, I let the existence of that video hang in the air, a mirror he couldn't avoid. Because kids like Lucas don't change when you lecture them about rules. They change when they see themselves clearly for the first time. And that moment right there was the beginning of the unraveling. Lucas kept staring at the floor like the tile suddenly had all the answers he'd been avoiding. His knee bounced faster, the rhythm tight and erratic, and for the first time since he walked onto that stage, he didn't look bored, he looked cornered. Not by me, not by his mother, but by the truth he knew was coming. And truth, when you've built your entire identity around dodging, it feels like a threat. I told him again that we wouldn't play anything without his consent, but he didn't answer. His jaw clenched and he swallowed hard the way people do when they're fighting a reaction they don't want anyone to see. Kids who claim they don't care about anything don't usually react to the idea of evidence, but Lucas did. That alone told me more about his emotional reality than the last 30 minutes of shrugging and smirking. His mother reached over, placing a shaking hand on his arm. He didn't pull away, even though he normally would. That was another shift, small but meaningful. Defiant kids don't allow contact when they're in performance mode. But when the walls start to crack, touch becomes grounding, stabilizing. And in Lucas's case, it exposed just how brittle his confidence really was. I asked him what he thought the video would show. He said he didn't know, but I could hear the lie in the flatness of his tone. People who truly don't know lean into uncertainty. People who do know try to sound detached. Lucas was detached in the way a person is when they're afraid the truth might break something inside them. His mother whispered that she'd watched it. Her voice cracked when she said it. Lucas's head jerked up, not in anger, but in surprise. Surprise she'd seen him like that. Surprise she'd witnessed a version of him he didn't want her to see. That reaction told me exactly what I needed to know. Beneath every act of rebellion sits a child terrified of letting someone down. I told him again that the purpose wasn't to humiliate him. It was to bring clarity. You can't fix what you won't face. He finally muttered that he didn't care if we watched it, but the stiffness in his shoulders said the opposite. Permission given out of resignation isn't real permission. So I didn't press play. I wanted him present, not dissociated. Instead, I began describing what the footage contained, not the dramatic parts, not the legal aspects, but the human details, the swerving, the delayed reactions. The officer approaching the window and Lucas barely able to keep his eyes open. The slurred responses that weren't from substances but from exhaustion and adrenaline. The way he laughed when asked for a license, even though there was nothing funny about the situation, he winced. Not visibly to most people, but I caught it. A tightening around the eyes, a shallow breath he tried to cover with a shrug. Shame, when it hits for the first time, doesn't explode, it flickers. His mother covered her mouth, her shoulders shaking as she listened. Tears pooled in her eyes. She wasn't crying because of the legal consequences. She was crying because she'd imagined what could have happened. And fear, real parental fear, has a specific sound in a parent's breath. I've heard it too many times. Lucas saw her reaction and broke his stare at the floor. His eyes flicked to her, and something in his expression shifted. The defiance cracked. The mask slipped. It wasn't rebellion anymore, it was guilt. Raw, unfiltered, unpolished guilt. The kind that surfaces only when a young man realizes, maybe for the first time, that his choices can break the people who love him. I told him I wanted him to imagine watching that video alone, not with the intention to punish himself, but to understand the version of himself captured in it. He said quietly that he didn't want to see it. I asked why. He said he didn't like how he looked. I asked what he meant. He said he looked stupid, reckless, out of control. Those were his first real admissions. And sometimes the smallest admission is the doorway to the truth a person's been hiding behind bravado. He said he didn't want his mom to see him like that. His voice cracked on the last two words. Not much, but enough. I asked him what like that meant. He whispered that it meant weak, that it meant irresponsible, that it meant he wasn't who he pretended to be. Kids like Lucas build entire identities out of pretending not to care, pretending rules don't matter, pretending consequences bounce off them, pretending adulthood is already in their grasp. But the minute they see themselves reflected back in a moment of real danger, the fantasy crumbles. His mother wiped her eyes and said she wasn't angry, she was scared. Terrified she'd lose him. Terrified he'd end up another headline. Terrified the call she got in the middle of the night wouldn't be from the police, but from the coroner. Lucas looked stricken. That was the word, stricken. Not annoyed, not dismissive, not guarded, stricken. I asked him if he'd ever thought about what would have happened if another car had been coming, if a pedestrian had been crossing, if a child had been on a bike. His face twisted. He said he didn't want to think about it. I told him that thinking about it was necessary, not to shame him, but to awaken the part of him that still had a conscience. He ran a hand through his hair, leaned back, then forward again, unable to settle. The internal battle had begun. The version of him that lived off of rule breaking was wrestling with the version that saw the reality of what could have happened, and that battle needed to happen. Without it, he'd just keep spiraling. I told him something important. I said he didn't end up in that car at 2 a.m. because he was fearless. He ended up there because he was lost. Kids who feel grounded don't need adrenaline to validate them. Kids who feel secure don't need rebellion to feel powerful. And kids who feel love don't need danger to prove they're alive. He didn't argue. He didn't interrupt. He didn't roll his eyes. He just sat there breathing hard, the truth settling in his bones. Then I said the words that pierced straight through the armor he'd been wearing. You don't break rules because you don't care. You break them because you're hurting. His face changed. The audience saw it. His mother saw it. I saw it. The truth hit him like a wave he wasn't prepared to withstand. His chin trembled and he looked away quickly, trying to hide it. But that's the thing about emotional unraveling. It doesn't ask permission. I told him he didn't need to be tough on my stage. He didn't need to act like he had everything figured out. He didn't need to perform an identity built out of fear of failure. What he needed was honesty, real honesty. And then he finally said it. He said he didn't feel like anything he did mattered. Not to his teachers, not to his friends, not to himself. He said breaking rules was the only time he felt in control, the only time he felt visible. The only time he felt anything at all, His mother broke down completely. And Lucas, for the first time, stopped pretending he didn't care. Lucas sat there with his shoulders rounded in a way I hadn't seen from him before. The arrogance, the bravado, the practiced indifference, they all slid off him like someone had finally turned off the spotlight he'd been performing under. What remained was a 17-year-old kid who looked exhausted from carrying an identity that never actually fit him. I let the silence sit for a moment. Silence isn't empty in moments like that. It's full. It gives the truth space to breathe. And Lucas was breathing like someone who just surfaced after staying underwater too long. He rubbed the sleeve of his hoodie between his fingers the way anxious kids do when they're trying to keep themselves from unraveling. His voice was quieter when he spoke again, but not in a defeated way quieter, like he was finally speaking from somewhere real instead of somewhere rehearsed. He said he didn't know how to stop messing up. He said every time he tried to do the right thing, he ended up disappointing someone anyway. And after a while, he just stopped trying because failure hurt more than rebellion. That landed, not just for his mother, but for everyone in that room. Because here was a kid who wasn't defying rules because he felt powerful, he was defying rules because he felt powerless. And when people feel powerless, they grab control in whatever form it comes. For Lucas, that was breaking boundaries. His mother leaned forward, tears carving down her face. She said she'd had no idea he felt that way. Lucas shrugged, not out of disrespect, but out of fear. He said he didn't want her to worry. He said he didn't want to make things worse at home. He said he didn't want her to think he was weak. Weak. That word hit me harder than anything else he'd said. Kids who grow up believing vulnerability equals weakness walk through life armored in behaviors that hurt them more than anyone else. And Lucas had been wearing that armor so long he couldn't tell where it ended, and he began. I told him that admitting you're hurting isn't weakness. Pretending you're fine while you destroy yourself, that's weakness. Strength is honesty. Strength is facing what scares you instead of numbing it with chaos. Strength is telling the truth even when the truth is messy. He didn't look convinced yet, but he didn't dismiss it either. That was progress. I turned to his mother and asked her what she thought Lucas needed. She said he needed structure, boundaries, expectations, all the things she used to try to provide before she got too exhausted to keep fighting. She said every rule she set turned into an argument. Every boundary became a battlefield. She said she felt like she'd been trying to parent a tornado. Lucas flinched at that. Not because she was wrong, but because the image reflected something he wasn't proud of. I asked him how he felt hearing his mother describe life with him that way. He swallowed and said he didn't want to be that kind of son. Not really. He said he didn't know how to be different. That's when I leaned in a little. Not to intimidate him, but to anchor him. I told him change doesn't come from knowing how, it comes from deciding why. Once the why is strong enough, the how starts revealing itself piece by piece. He shifted in his chair, and I could tell the conversation was moving from resistance to introspection. His eyes weren't darting around the room anymore. They were fixed on a point in the distance like he was replaying the choices that brought him there. Then his mother said something that cracked him open. She said she was afraid he didn't care whether he lived or died. And she said she'd never said that out loud until that moment because she didn't want to burden him with her fear. Lucas's eyes filled instantly. He didn't look away this time. He just stared at her, stunned, like he was seeing the impact of his actions reflected back at him for the very first time. He asked her softly why she would think that. She said, because every risk he took every night he disappeared, every decision he made without thinking, felt like he was daring the world to destroy him. Lucas shook his head, tears slipping out despite his attempts to blink them back. He said he didn't want to die. He said he just didn't feel like anything he did mattered enough to protect. And when someone doesn't value themselves, they don't value their safety either. That was the moment the emotional peak began taking shape. The confrontation not with me, not with his mother, but with himself. I reminded him of something simple but essential. Nobody is born understanding their worth. Worth is learned through relationships, responsibility, accomplishment, and reflection. But when one or more of those elements are disrupted, like his father leaving, kids start to believe they're on their own. And that belief becomes a lens that distorts everything. Lucas listened with a seriousness I hadn't seen from him before. He wasn't trying to argue. He wasn't trying to explain. He was absorbing. I asked him why he thought his actions didn't matter. He said because nobody stuck around long enough to care what he did anyway. Friends came and went. Teachers didn't bother trying. Coaches gave up on him. And his father was the blueprint for abandonment. His mother broke again at that. She tried to say something, but her voice cracked too hard for words to form. Lucas looked at her and said he didn't blame her, he blamed himself. He said maybe his dad left because he wasn't a good enough son. There it was, the core wound. The belief that had shaped every impulsive decision, every act of rebellion, every broken boundary. I told him his father's choices had nothing to do with his worth, that a child is never the reason a parent walks away. Children absorb abandonment like it's data about themselves, but I told him clearly his father left because of who his father was, not because of who Lucas was. The tears that followed weren't dramatic, they were quiet, human, raw. And his mother reached for him again, her hand trembling. This time he didn't hesitate. He leaned toward her, his body folding into the one place he'd been running from emotionally connection. It wasn't the solution, but it was the beginning of one. I asked Lucas what he wanted his relationship with his mother to look like. He said he wanted less fighting, more understanding. He wanted her to trust him, but he admitted he hadn't given her much reason to lately. That admission was the most mature thing he'd said all day. Then I asked him what he wanted for himself. Not what his mother wanted, not what school wanted, not what the law required. He looked up, eyes red, and said he wanted to feel like he mattered. He wanted to stop ruining things. He wanted to stop being the kid people warned others about. He wanted to feel proud of himself. And then he said something that told me the shift was real. He said he didn't want to watch the video because he already knew what it showed. It showed a kid who'd stopped caring about his own life, and he didn't want to be that kid anymore. That was the moment everything changed. When Lucas said he didn't want to be that kid anymore, the room shifted. Not physically, emotionally. It was the kind of shift you feel in your chest, like the atmosphere rearranged itself around a new truth he hadn't allowed himself to speak until that moment. There was no eye roll, no sarcasm, no defensive laugh. Just a young man finally admitting the person he'd been pretending to be wasn't sustainable and wasn't who he wanted to become. I told him that acknowledgement alone was a powerful first step. People underestimate the courage it takes to tell yourself the truth after months or years of denying it. And for a 17-year-old boy who'd built an entire identity around invincibility, admitting vulnerability might as well have been emotional freefall. His mother reached up and brushed his shoulder with her fingertips. It was a small movement, but Lucas didn't flinch away. He didn't tense up. He let her touch him gently, naturally, like some part of him had been starved for it without even realizing. I asked him what he thought the kid in the video needed. Not what he deserved, not what punishment was appropriate, what he needed. He thought about it for a long moment. Then he said that kid needed someone to stop him before he made a mistake he couldn't come back from. Someone who didn't give up on him. Someone who said no even when he acted like he didn't care. I nodded and told him he'd just described his mother. She let out a sound. I don't think she even meant to part sob, part exhale, part acknowledgement that she had been fighting for him even when she felt like she was losing. Lucas heard it and something softened deeper in him. Barriers built from years of resentment and fear melted a little more. I asked Lucas how long he'd felt like nothing he did mattered. He said it started around the time his dad left. He said he kept waiting for a reason, an explanation, anything that made sense. But when none came, he filled in the blanks himself. He assumed he wasn't good enough. And when a kid decides they're not good enough, they start living down to that conclusion. He said he felt invisible at school. Teachers acted like he was a problem to manage. Coaches acted like he was a disappointment. Friends treated him like entertainment, the guy who'd do the daring thing, break the rule, get the reaction. They didn't admire him. They used him. and he wasn't emotionally equipped to tell the difference. I told him that when a young man doesn't know where he fits, he often tries on identities like hats, the rebel, the class clown, the tough guy, the kid who doesn't care. And if any of those roles get attention, even negative attention, they stick. Because being noticed feels better than being ignored, and being the rule breaker is at least a role with definition. He nodded, staring at the floor, his jaw working as he tried to process it all. I asked him when he last felt proud of something he did. He couldn't answer. He actually couldn't remember. That's not laziness. That's emotional erosion. When you haven't felt pride in years, you stop believing you're capable of earning it. His mother jumped in then, not with blame or frustration, but with a softness I could tell she hadn't felt safe enough to use in a long time. She said she remembered when he was little how he used to run home from school holding up some drawing or certificate or ribbon, desperate for her to hang it on the refrigerator. She said he used to beam when she was proud of him. She said she missed that boy. Lucas's face contorted, and he pressed his hand to his mouth like the emotion was too quick, too strong, too unfamiliar to manage. His shoulders shook once, then again, and then the tears came, not loud, not dramatic, but deep. The kind that come from loss, not pain. From remembering who you used to be, not who you've become. I told him that boy wasn't gone. He was buried under layers of defenses that were built to survive, not to thrive. And the fact that he was crying meant he still cared about his mother, about himself, about the direction his life was headed. Most defiant kids don't cry because they're sad. They cry because someone finally speaks to the part of them they've been hiding. Lucas looked up, eyes red, and whispered that he didn't know how to stop disappointing everyone. I told him the goal wasn't to stop disappointing people. That's impossible. The goal was to start valuing himself enough to make decisions he could be proud of. I reminded him that rules aren't cages, they're guardrails. They exist to protect you, not punish you. And I told him something else, something he needed to hear clearly. Discipline isn't control. Discipline is love in action. He'd never heard discipline framed that way. To him, discipline had always meant rejection, failure, not being enough. But if he could begin to see discipline as a pathway instead of a punishment, everything in his life could change. His mother said she'd been trying to set rules, but every time she did, the backlash from Lucas was so explosive she eventually gave up. She said she was tired of being the villain in his story. Lucas winced at the word villain. He said he didn't mean to make her feel that way. He just felt smothered, controlled, like she didn't trust him. She said she didn't trust his choices, not because she didn't love him, but because she loved him too much to ignore the danger he was putting himself in. And for the first time, Lucas nodded. Not defiantly, not sarcastically, he nodded because he understood. I asked him what boundaries he thought were important. He said curfew. Not a loose one, an actual one. He said he needed someone to tell him no when he didn't know how to tell it to himself. He said he didn't want to be set free to fail. That was huge. People don't admit they need boundaries unless they're ready to grow. I asked him what he wanted his next year of life to look like. He said he wanted to graduate. He wanted to get a job and keep it. He wanted to stop hanging around friends who encouraged his worst impulses. He wanted to prove to himself he wasn't doomed to be the kid in that video. And then he said something that stopped his mother cold. He said he wanted to earn her trust again, not demand it with attitude, not argue for it, not manipulate for it. Earn it. She covered her face, overwhelmed. I told Lucas, earning trust starts with consistency. Not perfection, consistency. Showing up, following through, making choices that line up with the man he wants to become, not the boy he's been pretending to be. Then I asked him if he wanted to watch the video after all. He took a breath, shaky but steady, and said yes. Not because he was ready to face the kid he had been, but because he was ready to become someone he could respect. And that's when I knew the turning point had arrived. Not when the video played, not when the tears came, not even when he admitted he cared. The turning point happened the moment he realized he still had a future worth fighting for. Lucas agreed to watch the video, but he didn't watch it the way a defiant teenager does, with crossed arms and rolled eyes. He watched it with the quiet focus of someone finally ready to understand the consequences of his actions. The room dimmed as the clip began, and the blue glow of the screen fell across his face. I wasn't watching the footage, I was watching him. The moment he saw himself behind the wheel, eyes half closed, movement sluggish, weaving across lanes, his face changed. There was no smirk, no shrug, no attempt to downplay what he was seeing. His jaw tightened, his eyebrows pulled together, and a flush crept up his neck. Embarrassment, fear, disbelief, all of it flickered across him in waves. His mother kept one hand pressed to her throat the entire time. When the officer approached the car window in the video and Lucas stumbled over his words, she let out a quiet whimper, the kind a parent makes when they're reliving the moment they almost lost their child. Lucas heard it. He closed his eyes for a second, just long enough to steady himself, and when he opened them again, the bravado was gone entirely. When the screen went dark, he didn't look at me. He didn't look at the audience. He turned toward his mother with tears welling in his eyes and whispered, not loudly, not dramatically, but with raw sincerity, "I'm sorry." His voice broke on the second word. That apology wasn't strategic, it wasn't extracted, it wasn't defensive. It was the kind that comes from finally seeing yourself from the outside and realizing the person in the reflection isn't who you want to be. His mother sobbed and pulled him into her arms, and this time he didn't stiffen or pull away. He leaned into her, his forehead against her shoulder, breathing in uneven bursts like someone who'd been running from a truth that finally caught him. I gave them the time they needed. Moments like that don't need commentary, they need room. When he finally sat upright again, he wiped his face with the sleeve of his hoodie. He didn't try to hide the tears. He didn't pretend they weren't there. He just breathed slow and deep like he was adjusting to a new emotional temperature. I asked him what he saw in that video. He said he saw a kid who thought he was untouchable, a kid who didn't realize how close he came to ruining his own life or someone else's. He said he didn't recognize the person he was watching. That told me everything. It meant he was separating his identity from his behavior, and that separation is essential for growth. If you believe your worst moment defines you, you stay stuck in it. But if you see it as something you did, not something you are, you can change. He said he hated that version of himself. I told him not to hate the kid in the video. That kid was hurt, confused, lost, running from feelings he didn't have the tools to express. You don't hate that kid, you help him grow. Lucas nodded slowly, taking that in. His breathing settled, his shoulders lowered. You could see the shift spreading through him like warmth returning to frozen limbs. His mother squeezed his hand. She didn't say anything she didn't have to. Her entire body was speaking for her. Relief, gratitude, love, fear melting into hope. I asked Lucas what he wanted to happen next. He said he wanted to take responsibility, real responsibility, not the performative kind. He said he was ready to follow rules, not because he finally liked them, but because he finally understood why they existed. He said he wanted to earn back, trust, not demand privileges he hadn't earned. Then he said something that hit harder than anything else that day. He said he wanted to live, not just exist, not just get through the day. He wanted a future one where he wasn't a burden, a disappointment, or a risk to himself. I told him that desire right there was the foundation of change. You can't fix someone who doesn't want to be better. But once the desire sparks, once it takes hold, you can help them build their entire life around that momentum. I talked to him about accountability. He listened, really listened. I talked to him about structure, routines, expectations. He didn't roll his eyes. I talked to him about emotional honesty, about allowing himself to be vulnerable without feeling weak. He nodded through all of it. His mother asked if he truly understood how scared she had been. Lucas looked at her and said he did now, not because someone lectured him into understanding, but because he had finally seen the evidence with his own eyes. And sometimes that's what it takes, a mirror. I asked Lucas what he wanted from his relationship with his mom moving forward. He said he wanted less yelling, fewer battles. He said he wanted her to trust him again, but more importantly, he said he wanted to be someone who deserved that trust. And then for the first time all day, he talked about his father. He said he used to think breaking rules made him strong because his dad had treated emotion like weakness. But watching that video, he realized strength wasn't what he'd been chasing, it was what he'd been avoiding. Real strength is taking responsibility. Real strength is controlling yourself, not the world around you. Real strength is admitting when you're scared. He said he didn't want to become a version of his father. He wanted to become a man his future family could rely on. A man who didn't run from responsibility but stood in it. His mother cried again, this time from a place of healing, not fear. As the conversation wound down, Lucas sat taller. Not arrogantly, not defiantly, just grounded, present. A young man beginning to take ownership of his life. And I told him what I tell anyone who reaches that turning point: your past does not define you. Your choices from this day forward do. He nodded with a steadiness I hadn't seen from him until that moment. When Lucas walked off that stage, he wasn't transformed, not yet. Transformation takes time, effort, setbacks, and resilience. But he was changed. And change is the moment the needle moves, the moment the story turns, the moment a kid who thought he didn't need rules finally understands why rules were trying to protect him in the first place. His mother followed him, her hand on his back, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't shrug it off. He let her walk beside him. And sometimes that's where rebuilding begins.